In the late summer of 1666, Isaac Newton supposedly discovered the force of gravity. Everybody knows the charming story of the apple and the great aha moment. But what if there's more to this story than what you've been told? What if Newton didn't discover anything, but rather made something up because the model of cosmology was changing? What if these changes to what people believe about cosmology were deliberate, intentional, and diabolical? What if the last 350 years of mainstream cosmological science hasn't been science at all, but rather a malevolent, religious indoctrination with an agenda to unite the world under the beast? What happens if gravity is actually discovered to be one of the greatest frauds of the last 400 years? Without the magic thread to tie it all together, the heliocentric conspiracy vanishes like chaff in the wind. This is 20 Reasons Why Gravity is a Fraud. Reason number 1. Gravity is purported to be a constant, but it acts inconsistently. If gravity was a constant force pulling things toward the Earth at a constant rate, then we should expect to see a balloon and a quarter both be pulled down. But they aren't because of density. The balloon is less dense than the air, while the quarter is more dense. Therefore, one goes up and the other goes down, because we live in a vertical density gradient. The heliocentric explanation is that gravity's pull is dependent on the mass of the object. But as you'll soon see, this is circular reasoning. The Earth is immense, and if it were exerting a force, it makes no sense for that force to be able to bend massive oceans while leaving butterflies alone. The point is that there is no force in the universe that acts so selectively on different objects within its own field of influence. Reason number 2. Another way gravity acts inconsistently is that for planets and bodies in space, it makes them orbit. But for people and things on Earth, it makes them fall to the center of the Earth. Have you ever thought about that? It makes zero sense. Either we should be floating around the Earth, or the Earth and the Moon and everything in our solar system would be pulled toward the center of the Sun and destroyed. Reason number 3. Yet another way that gravity acts inconsistently is through the Moon. If the Sun's gravity is strong enough to make all the planets orbit itself, why does the Moon orbit the Earth? How can the Sun pull a planet the size of Jupiter into orbit, or a planet as far away as Pluto, yet have no effect on the Earth's moon or other moons in the solar system orbiting their respective planets? Reason number 4. We are told that planets and the Earth have elliptical orbits. By default, an elliptical orbit requires 2 foci, or focal points. But in the heliocentric model, this happens only with 1 foci. The only way this would be possible is if gravity was increasing and decreasing constantly throughout the orbit to make it elliptical. If gravity was constant, then the orbit of the Earth around the Sun would be a perfect circle. But if the orbit was a perfect circle, then the ball Earth would not be able to explain seasons. This is why the orbits are said to be elliptical. But if that's the case, how and why is gravity fluctuating? Why is it that we can't experience or measure this fluctuation or any of its effects locally? Reason number 5. If orbits are elliptical and gravity is increasing and decreasing as the Earth goes around the Sun, then the increase in attractive force would cause massive acceleration. Either the Earth would be released from the Sun's orbit on the way out of the orbit when gravity weakens, or it would crash into the Sun when returning as gravity strengthens. There is no empirical way to demonstrate that the elliptical orbits of planets are possible or even sustainable with 1 foci and a constantly alternating attractive force. This is why gravity isn't based on science, but rather tricking your mind into believing it exists through models, math, and conjecture. Reason number 6. Objects that spin around other objects in uniform circular motion accelerate due to centripetal acceleration. If the Earth's orbit was circular, which it would have to be if gravity were a constant force, you would have no seasons. The Earth would also eventually accelerate into the Sun or out of the solar system. The accelerated orbit would also produce a shortening of time, because years would get shorter and shorter. Yet solar years have stayed relatively the same for human history. So either way, gravity fails. If it's a constant force, creating circular orbits, or if it's a fluctuating force, creating elliptical orbits. Both cases do not survive the scrutiny of science or logic. Reason number 7. We are told that the moon's gravity is responsible for the tides, but this makes no sense. One simple observation against this is that all bodies of water, even the Great Lakes, do not experience any change when the moon is supposedly closer to the Earth. Another observation is that the tides vary drastically even a few hundred miles away from each other. One tide might be 6 feet, while the other, only a few hundred miles away, might be 29 feet. The heliocentric model tells us that high tides even occur on opposite sides of the world, which makes zero sense if they're being created by the moon's proximity to the Earth. If the moon was actually affecting the tides with an invisible force, the effects should be uniform and only on the side of the Earth that the moon was closest to. Every animal, including us, is also mostly water, yet we feel nothing different or see anything different when the moon is supposedly closer to the Earth. Reason number 8. Another problem with the moon and tides is that the moon is both dozens of times smaller than the Earth, and therefore weaker in gravity, and also considerably far away in the heliocentric model. How then can it pull water up and create tides when the water is much closer to the Earth and being pulled down by the Earth's gravity, which is much stronger? It would not be possible because one force would outweigh the other, rendering the weaker force essentially inactive. So, what causes the tides? The answer is density and temperature. The salinity and temperature of water make it more or less dense, and these fluctuations have relationships to the sun's movements across the sky, ocean currents, and other natural processes that make the water expand or contract based on heat energy from the sun. These changes in turn cause the tides that we see, without having to invent a magical force that you have to believe in. Reason number 9. Gravity's reasoning is circular. In order to calculate the force of gravity, you have to assume the mass of the Earth. But the heliocentric model estimates the mass of the Earth by supposedly measuring the force of gravity. This is called circular reasoning, and it is yet another proof that gravity is a fraud. Reason number 10. Mass itself is another problem worth discussing. Physical things have weight, which is a property of matter. These are things that we learned very early on in life. But modern physics inverts this truth to justify gravity and the heliocentric conspiracy. It says that mass is how much matter something has, and weight is a product of gravity acting on that matter. Do you see what they did? Do you see how they inserted gravity into the mix without ever questioning whether it even exists? What if gravity doesn't exist? It means that matter exists and it has weight, and there's no need for the made-up term of mass. Unfortunately, physics has divorced matter from its natural property, which is weight, so that gravity could be justified. But gravity has never been proven, and weight, as a function of gravity acting on mass, is a hypothesis, not empirical reality. Reason number 11. Gravity violates the first law of thermodynamics, or the conservation of energy. The first law says that work that is done in the universe always has a cost. If you use electricity, it costs you energy from somewhere else to generate that electricity. If you lift weights, it burns calories. If you light a fire, you'll need some kind of fuel, like wood. With gravity, however, this is not the case. Gravity is constantly creating work by pulling objects to the Earth. Yet, this work has no energy source. Where is gravity getting its inexhaustible reserves to constantly create work in the universe? Is the Earth's mass an infinite battery? How does that work with the laws of physics and energy conservation and entropy? The answer is that it doesn't work because gravity is a fraud. Reason number 12. Gravity violates the second law of thermodynamics, which is entropy. The second law states that things tend to go from order to disorder, or from more organized states to less organized states. The heliocentric model says that we have an atmosphere next to a vacuum, or a near vacuum without a barrier. But this is impossible because of entropy. Heliocentrism explains this by appealing to gravity, which supposedly holds the atmosphere close to the Earth without the need for a barrier. But this breaks the second law of thermodynamics and has never been reproduced empirically. What can be reproduced is a container with a density gradient of various gases that are contained by a barrier. In fact, the very existence of gas pressure necessitates a container, regardless of how big, because gas pressure is a measurement of gas pushing on the walls of a container. No container, no gas pressure. No gas pressure, no atmosphere. Yet again, gravity fails. Reason number 13. Another way that gravity violates the second law of thermodynamics is by claiming that the orbits of planets and bodies in space have been orderly and maintained for millions and millions of years. This is especially problematic if orbits have to be elliptical, because remember that elliptical orbits require gravity to constantly fluctuate at just the right time. There is no explanation as to how the planets and stars maintain such order over enormous time frames, and no empirical proof that this would ever be possible. Reason number 14. Water always finds its level, and every empirical observation of water's behavior from oceans to lakes to cups of water are consistent that it finds its level within its container. The sun's reflection on the ocean's horizon shows that water is level. According to the ball model, water bends over the curve of the Earth, but this has never been observed nor reproduced. If water was being bent, such reflections would not be possible, because light reflecting off of a sphere creates a focal point. Furthermore, if a force existed that was strong enough to bend massive bodies of water, just imagine what it would do to every living thing on Earth, since we are mostly water. Reason number 15. We are told that 95% of the universe is dark energy and dark matter, which are things that physicists know very little to nothing about. But this means that when dealing with things like the Cavendish experiment or gravitational waves, it is impossible to come to a conclusion as to the true nature of what's actually being observed, because there are too many unknowns, especially at such tiny levels of specificity. In other words, because gravity is supposedly so weak, it is impossible to isolate it as an independent variable in any experiment purporting to detect it, especially when modern physics claims that most of the universe is made of something they know little to nothing about. Reason number 16. According to Einstein, gravity is not a force but a warping of space. But space is empty. It's not filled with anything and has no material background. Therefore, you can't warp and bend nothing. The term curved space is a meaningless term. If gravity waves existed, which they don't, what are they actually bending or waving? Space is not a medium like water or air. This is why they have tried to look for gravitons and failed. And the discovery of gravitational waves was worse than the Cavendish experiments in terms of poor controls and propaganda. Both Newton and Einstein relied on obscure mathematics to justify their theories, not empirical evidence. Reason number 17. Cavendish supposedly discovered an incredibly weak force through his experiments, proving that matter attracts matter. Yet there are many problems with these experiments. For a force that is as weak as he claimed it to be, there were no controls done to eliminate the influence of other things vibrating or acting at such small levels. Remember that 95% of the universe, according to them, is made up of stuff that they have little to no clue about. That is a huge margin of ignorance. Cavendish's experiments were also never replicated with larger masses or different materials. We also don't see these effects when we go to large mountain ranges. You don't feel anything different being closer to these giant clumps of matter, nor do you see tiny leaves or dust floating around them in orbit. Reason number 18. Cavendish's experiment was never done vertically. If such a property actually existed, then you should be able to test it vertically too. For example, take 2 pennies and then place them right under 2 objects with different masses. Let's say the first object can be an orange, while the second is a large wrecking ball. Suspend these 2 objects several meters off the ground. The penny that is dropped from right under contact with the wrecking ball should theoretically hit the ground last because of the influence of attraction from the wrecking ball. In other words, if matter actually attracted matter by gravity, we should see a lag time for the object that was dropped from the bigger source of gravity, which is the wrecking ball, than the one dropped from the smaller source, which would be the orange. But that's not at all what we see. We see a consistent drop for both pennies, which proves there is no attraction between matter via some imaginary force called gravity. The pennies fall because density is a property of our universe, and the density gradient is structured vertically. Reason number 19. Nikola Tesla, who was a renowned genius, did not agree with Einstein. In fact, many people didn't agree with Einstein, but their voices were silenced by the propaganda machine. Nikola Tesla believed in the ether, which is a type of primary substance that fills and oscillates within all things. Most people believed this up until the 20th century, and this includes ancient cultures. Tesla believed electromagnetism and ether could very well explain the minor attraction of matter. But has anyone bothered to investigate his theories? The answer is no, because Tesla died broke and persecuted because the government confiscated his materials for coming up with free energy, never to be shown the light of day again. Other famous experiments that proved a stationary Earth, the existence of an ether, and Einstein's relativity wrong were done by Sagnac, Airy, and Morley, and are all worth your investigation. Reason number 20. Gravity is a hypothesis which is based on an assumption. It assumes a spherical Earth, but when you make this assumption, there are countless problems that come up, like water bending, or pressure existing next to a vacuum without a barrier, or bodies breaking the laws of acceleration. This is why gravity is needed. It is what weaves the entire heliocentric model together. Yet gravity has never been proven empirically. It is a hypothesis based on an assumption and justified with math. In other words, gravity is just smoke and mirrors. So, if gravity doesn't exist and the Earth isn't a spinning ball, how do we explain things falling down? The answer is actually very simple. Density. All matter is arranged according to its density. The denser something is, the heavier it is, and so it will fall past anything lighter than itself. The rate at which things fall past other things is a constant of the universe, just like many other countless constants that God created as part of our reality. You do not need to invent a magical force to explain why things fall at a constant rate. But why don't things fall left or right? Why towards the Earth? You could ask the same question with gravity. Why does gravity supposedly pull things toward the center of an object? That's just the way it works. Of course, you know by now that gravity is a fraud, but in the same way this is how density and the properties of our world work. And on a fundamental level, it all has to do with God. In an enclosed model of the Earth where the Earth is a stationary plane, God is at the top, at the highest point, surveying all things. That is why he is called the Most High. It all has to do with him. When God created the world, he gave it length, width, and height. The height of the sky is so enormous that it gives us an idea of what he means when he says in Isaiah 55 verse 9, "As the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts higher than your thoughts." But more importantly are the properties of how this vertical dimension relates in terms of weight and matter. Lighter things fly, while heavy things sink to the bottom. Many times in the Bible, salvation is compared to the lifting of a burden, and salvation is central to who God is and what he does. When Jesus says in Matthew 11 verse 30 that his burden is light and that his yoke is easy, it is a reference to his grace and his ways. How could mankind understand what it means to have a light burden if weight and density weren't a property of the universe? How could mankind understand what it means to lift a burden unless there was a way for weight and density to relate to one another vertically in relationship to God's position and ours? Gravity does not exist, my friend, and it is a magical spell woven by the beast to invert creation and rob glory from God. It makes no sense, it is contradictory, it is inconsistent, and it has never been proven or its effects ever been reproduced. What we see is consistent with a flat, motionless plane that is governed by a density gradient. Weight is a natural property of matter, just like density, and mass is an irrelevant extra category invented to justify the fraud of gravity. As such, with gravity revealed for what it is, heliocentrism has nothing to stand on and is categorically debunked.